Patty Simpson with Simpson Math. In this video, we're going to look at changing percents to decimals and vice versa. In a previous video, we looked to see how percents, decimals, and fractions are all really just the same thing. Percents are just always with 100 in the denominator, where decimals have tenths, hundredths, or maybe thousandths in the denominator. So we're going to, in this video, just turn these percents to decimals and vice versa. And in order to do that, first we're going to look at them in fractional form. So this 40%, we could rewrite that, since we know that it's really just a fraction with 100 in the denominator. So 40 hundredths. Well, when we write that as a decimal, we know that the hundredths place is, well, tenths, hundredths. So we need it to be 40 out in the hundredths place. That zero needs to be in the hundredths place. So as a decimal, we could write it as 0.40, 40 hundredths. Or remember that having 4 dimes and no pennies is the same as just having 4 dimes. So you could just rewrite that as 4 tenths. Or if you think about reducing this fraction or simplifying this fraction, divide the top and the bottom by 10, and you end up with 4 tenths. 4 tenths. Here, let's first turn this one into a fraction, and then we'll look at it as a decimal. Again, the percent means that it's out of 100. So this 4% means 4 out of 100. If I turn that into a decimal, again, the hundredths place, well, tenths, hundredths. I need the 4, the last digit here, to be in that hundredths place. This time, I need to put a 0 as a placeholder. I have 4 pennies and 0 dimes. So I'm going to put that 0 there in the tenths place. I can't rewrite that in a simpler form. So 4 hundredths is the same as 4 hundredths as a decimal. One more example here, and that is if we have 400%. Well, 400%, again, that percent means out of 100. So here I've got 4 out of 100, and I have this decimal, tenths, hundredths place. I need the last digit in that hundredths place. That means that the 4 is out in front of the decimal. Or I could just rewrite that as a solid 4. Or divide the top and bottom by 100, and you see 400 divided by 100 is just equal to 4. Notice in each one of these, what is happening? My decimal with 40 would be here on the end. If I move that decimal 2 spots to the left, 1, 2, I end up with that 4 tenths. In this case, my decimal would be behind the 4. If I move that 2 spots to the left, I end up with 0.04. And in this case, my decimal would be here. And if I take and move that decimal 2 spots to the left, and that's because I have tenths and hundredths position for my decimal, the hundredths position, I end up with just a 4. I'm going to do the same thing here, going from decimal to percent. So in this case, I've got 8 hundredths. This is tenths, and that's hundredths. I could rewrite that as 8 out of 100. So 8 out of every 100. Or as a percent, percent is always out of 100. So now, since this is out of 100, I can just turn that 100 denominator into a percent sign so that I have 8%. Here I have 8 tenths. I'm going to rewrite that as a fraction, 8 tenths. But in order for me to turn it into a percent, I need it to be out of 100. So in order to get it out of 100, well, one thing I could do is I could make this is tenths, this is hundredths. I could just add a 0 there to make it hundredths. Or in my fraction, I can multiply the top and the bottom by 10 to get 80 out of 100. Either way, I now have it out of 100 or to the hundredths place. And so now it is 80 turn that 100 into a percent sign, or the hundredths place into that percent sign. So this is 80 out of 100. 80 out of 100 is the same as that 8/10. Last but not least, here we have 8. I'm going to do the same thing there, where right now that is over 1 if I make it into a fraction, because it's not in the tenths or the hundredths place. So if I want to turn that into a percent, well, that's 8 over 1. 8 divided by 1 then is just equal to 8. And so in order to make it out of 100, I would have to multiply the top and the bottom by 100. Or you can think of it here, my decimal on this 8 is right behind it. I go to the tenths place to the hundredths place. So it's 8.00 to get to that hundredths place, or 800 over 100. Now that I have it in the out of 100, then I can write it as its percent, 800%. So percent is always out of 100, whereas my decimals are out of tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So let's look at a couple of just tricky ones and see if we can do them, if we can go back and forth now between the two. So what about if I have 42.8%? So again, I could just use my little trick that I learned here. Wherever my decimal is, I'm just going to move it over 2 spots to the left. Or looking at it as a fraction first, I could say that 42.8 or 42 8/10 is out of 100. That's what that percent sign tells me, is that it's out of 100. Well, in order to get rid of that decimal then, or I would need to multiply the top and the bottom by 10, and I end up with 428. If I multiply the bottom by 10, I end up with 1,000. So in this case, when I get ready to write it as a decimal, I'm going to go out to the thousandths place. So I have my decimal, and then I do 428 in the thousandths place. So this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths place. Or just think of that decimal being moved over 2 spots. Notice that the decimal moved over 2 spots. How about if we do another tricky one? How about 0.01%? So if we look at that 0.01%, remember this is out of 100. So it's 0.01 out of 100. And I want to make that into a decimal. Well, I'm going to first get rid of this decimal on top here by multiplying the top and the bottom by 100. If I multiply this by 100, I end up with 1. And if I multiply the bottom by 100, I end up with 10,000. So this is going to be in the 10,000ths place. So there's tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths place. Again, notice what happened is I moved it over 2 spots to the left. So when I'm going from a percent to a decimal, I'm moving that decimal over 2 spots to the left. So 0.01 out of 100 is the same as 1/10,000ths. If I were to divide my pizza into 10,000ths. Okay, then what about if we go the other direction? So now let's look at a decimal, 0.008 or 8/1000ths. So tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 8/1000ths, and I want to write that as a percent. Well, my percent is out of 100, so you know tenths, hundredths. So that decimal is going to end up right in front of my 8, or you can think of it as dividing by 10 here, so that I end up with 0.8 over 100. So that is equal to 0.8%. So notice in this case, my decimal is just moving over 2 spots to end up with that 0.8%. So we can turn percents into decimals by just moving our decimal to the left 2 spots, or always just think of percent as out of 100. and work from there. And then to turn a decimal into a percent, you just move your decimal to the left 2 spots to turn it into a percent, out to the hundredths place. Math made simple at Simpson Math. Thanks for watching.